Operation Tiro-Tiro, or the Battle of Savate, as it became known, was the first time the South African Defence Force had engaged FAPLA in battle since 1975. And, despite the record number of casualties, it was 3-2 Battalion's biggest victory since its formation in March 1976. British paratroopers still remember Arnhem as a costly failure, but also as a magnificent example of paratrooper courage in the face of terrible odds, when pitched against several German divisions, one of which was an SS Panzer division. The French Foreign Legion remembers the heroic and stubborn stand of a small force of legionnaires, when attacked and totally wiped out by an overwhelming force of Mexicans. The paratroopers of the South African Defence Force remember a tough contest that almost ended in disaster, when they fought and won a battle against tremendous odds at Kassinga. Similarly, 3-2 Battalion had adopted the Battle of Savate as the leitmotif, to forever afterwards remember 3-2 Battalion comrades who fell during Savate, mainly because it was the highest casualty rate they ever had after Bravo Group had become part of the South African Army. Even though the border war came to an end in 1989, and 3-2 Battalion was disbanded in March 1993, to this day, a remembrance service and parade are held annually on the Sunday closest to 21st of May to commemorate the Battle of Savate, and to remember 3-2 Battalion's victory and the price they paid. This, amateur-produced account of Operation Tiro-Tiro, is based on the book The Battle of Savate, 3-2 Battalion's Greatest Battle by author Pete Norkia. The first edition, published in 2014, describes the operation, its motivations and planning, its achievements and failures, and vividly recreates the experience of what happened on the ground. Also included are Savate Day parades and events until 2012, and the Savate Battlefield Tour. The second edition has additional information which was unknown in 2014. This includes the FAPLA commander's confirmation of the Savate base strength on the day of the attack, and the number of FAPLA casualties. The all-rank nominal roll, previously only included leader group, the 2013 to 2024 Savate Day events, and the 2024 Savate Battlefield Tour. The 266-page softcover book includes 38 pages of color photographs, 19 detailed maps and diagrams, and copies of the official war diary and recollections of 34 Savate battle veterans. For more information on the Battle of Savate book, and other 3-2 Battalion books by author Pete Norkia, visit webpage www.petenorkia.com. For inquiries, send email to books@petenorkia.com. To secure the Namibia border, South Africa in the late 1960s and early 1970s had military base built south of the border, from where the South African Army conducted counterinsurgency patrols to prevent SWAPO entering the country. At the end of Operation Savannah, in March 1976, the Angolan military controlled most of southern Angola. UNITA had taken in the town Jamba, in the southeastern corner of Angola, and control most of southeast Angola from there. The Angolan government had allowed SWAPO to establish bases on their territory, and from there infiltrate into Namibia's Ovamboland. East of the Cubango River, adjacent to the Namibia-Angola border, lays a waterless and uninhabited area not occupied by FAPLA. In late 1979, UNITA expand their guerrilla operations into this area. An important strategic objective was to eliminate any insurgency from Angola into Kaokoland, Kavango, and Caprivi. By doing this, the main effort to clear Ovamboland could be achieved more cost-effectively. When the Minister of Defense, P.W. Botha, became South Africa's Prime Minister, the South Africa's low-level military aid to UNITA, in the form of food, weapons and ammunition escalated. Considering FAPLA's recent reorganization, the South African generals believed there was no point in supplying weapons to an untrained resistance movement, and that UNITA army should be trained, and a decision was made to accelerate and expand the training of the UNITA guerrillas. South African Defence Force Chief Staff Intelligence, Colonel Flip du Preez, had been coordinating the support to UNITA from an office in Sector 20, Rundu since 1977. Commandant Marius Ilshig replaced Dupreez, at the Rundu office as the officer commanding the Special Tasks Field Office in January 1979. Ilshig's main responsibility was, as primary liaison and executive officer, for UNITA Angola's Cuando-Cubango province. He reported to Major General Janny Geldenhuys, the general officer commanding of Southwest Africa Command, later renamed to Southwest Africa Territorial Force. The strategy regarding the nature and scope of support to UNITA was significantly influenced by Geldenhuys's strategy for the region. At their first meeting, Ilshig received his first strategic guidelines. He remembers. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that he expected me, meaning UNITA, to keep Sector 20's doorstep clean. The ensuing operational concept was, to harass and interdict the lines of communication to such an extent, that continued occupation by FAPLA, of isolated bases like Calais, Dirico, Kwanger, Savate and Pupa would be unsustainable. In the beginning of 1979, the first signs of SWAPO's insurgents, infiltrating the Kavango region, began to surface. Intelligence reports suggested that SWAPO was looking to activate the Kavango, and create a foothold for further infiltration of the Manchti, the traditional white farming area, and beyond. FAPLA's occupation of all the towns, along the Okavango River, meant that SWAPO had readily available bases to supply logistical support and protection. Those bases, located some distance from the border, were conveniently situated to serve as staging areas for SWAPO operations against Sector 20. Such insurgencies would be a major problem for the South African Defence Force, leading to extended call-ups of citizen force units and additional budgetary allocations, things that the South African Army wanted to avoid at all costs. Therefore, while there were no indications that it was going to happen yet, UNITA, with South African support, nevertheless went on a 6-week offensive. On 21st of March, 600 compact guerrillas attacked the town of Samavara, on the bank of the Quito River. Within an hour, the town was taken. On 17th of April, the UNITA Battalion, with no South African support, successfully attacked Kwanger. On 19th of April, 3-2 Battalion's Corporal Etienne Venter, and his mortar group, assisted by men from Reconnaissance Regiment, bombarded the Mpupa base. As predicted, the enemy vacated the base. On 19th of May Calais was successfully attacked, in a combined Reconnaissance Regiment, and a UNITA operation. This attack signaled the last of UNITA's activities for a while, as preparation for its National Congress, starting on 27th of May, was already underway. Savimbi seemed to think it was more important for his commanders to attend the Congress than conduct operations. FAPLA's 16th and 67th Brigades launched their next offensive, codenamed Operation Kilo Kilo, in July 1979. By the middle of July, 67 Brigade had captured Kwanger, and reoccupy all the towns along the Kuvango River. On 18th of September, General Geldenhuys met with Savimbi and other high-ranking UNITA officers, with the objective of integrating Southwest Africa Command's operational plan for southern Angola with the overall planning and strategy of UNITA support. UNITA forces attacked Rito and Mavinga in October, but saw little success in November and December. By year-end, UNITA had lost the initiative, and FAPLA had reoccupied all captured towns. In January, Chief Staff Intelligence asked General Geldenhuys to use 3-2 Battalion to reoccupy Dirico, because in enemy hands, it was a threat to the UNITA logistical route, being used to supply forces east of the Quito River, from their stronghold in Mukaso. A final reconnaissance on 10th of January, however, found that the FAPLA occupiers had already left Dirico, leaving only individual enemies in the base, who departed soon after. The 3-2 Battalion Recce Wing, nevertheless completely destroyed the bridge spanning the Quito River, cutting off the only means of crossing the river from Dirico. During a meeting in Rundu, on 31st of January, the Forward Angolan Joint Management Center was established, to coordinate the strategy that had been developed for the UNITA support. Before the committee had a chance to meet, in mid-February, FAPLA led what was thought to be an unexpected offensive in the Cuando-Cubango province. The Rundu field office also received intelligence from UNITA, that 3 FAPLA battalions, supported by fighter jets, and 3 helicopters, were operating in the area northeast of Kayundo, with the intention of moving south to reinforce Quang'er. It was deduced that FAPLA wanted to catch off-guard FALA guerrillas in the Kwando Kubango and destroy them, to achieve their 1979 objectives in the province. South African intelligence sources, however, thought it might be a reaction to a sudden upsurge in FALA attacks and ambushes. But both the South African and UNITA intelligence communities were wrong regarding the FAPLA offensive. FAPLA High Command had realized the tactical impossibility of effectively occupying and supporting bases along the Okavango and Quito rivers, and of conducting anti-UNITA operations, with only one brigade from a brigade headquarters at Kayundo. The reported activity was FAPLA's 60 Brigade, commanded by Captain Eusebio de Brito Teixeira, taking over the Savate base, from 67 Brigade, which relocate to Kayundo, to conduct operations from their north towards Minong, east to Baisha Longa, and west to Ayond. Teixeira's brigade took over the bases along the Okavango River. The first committee meeting was held on 16 March, to coordinate UNITA's plan of action, with the SADF's own concept for operations in Angola until July 1980. A plan formed around the intended capture of Quang'er, Calais, Bupa and Rivungo before 31st of May, and the towns of Rito and Savate before 30 of June. While UNITA would be responsible for these attacks, Recce Commandos and 3-1, 3-2 and 3-5 battalions would provide clandestine support in the name of UNITA. To facilitate operational planning and control, a joint South African Defence Force and UNITA Command and Control Committee was established in Rundu. The joint plan to regain control over the Kwando Kubango province began to be implemented at the beginning of April. Quang'er was the strongest and best defended of the bases along the Okavango River, and so the committee decided that the attack on Quang'er should start without delay. A trained UNITA battalion, supported by a 32 Battalion mortar platoon, was used for the attack. The attack started at first light on 14 of April, and by 10 o'clock the town and base had been captured and secured. UNITA lost 12 men. The enemy fled, leaving behind some vehicles. UNITA occupied and reinforced the town. The focus now shifted to Mpupa and Rivungo. On 6 of April, a 4-man 3-1 Battalion Recce team had started a reconnaissance of Mpupa. When they returned on 12 of April, they had only covered 50% of the area. To gain more information on Mpupa, Chief Staff Intelligence approached the 32 Battalion commander, Commandant Dion Ferreira, and asked him to send 3-2 Battalion Recce teams on snatch operations to Calais and Dorico, hoping to get information from captured enemy. On the night of 26 of April, the Dorico snatch went terribly wrong, but the Calais one was a success and enough information was received to plan attacks. After the snatch operation, the FAPLA forces in Calais and Dorico either realized that a possible attack was forthcoming, or that they were cut off from supplies at Savate after the capture of Quang'er, and they vacated their bases. In the meantime, FAPLA's 60 Brigade commander, Teixeira, was detached from Savate to Quito Cuanavale, and a 23-year-old Alferez, Portuguese for ensign or second lieutenant, named Daniel Rufino took his place. Rufino was not an experienced commander, he had been the brigade's political commissar. On 2nd of May, a second trained UNITA semi-regular battalion was sent from Mukaso to reinforce Quang'er, which meant that only one semi-regular battalion was available for an attack on Mpupa, which was not enough. On 7 of May, the Joint Planning Committee decided instead to concentrate on Savate, because its capture would relieve the threat of a FAPLA counterattack on Quang'er. After considering the available UNITA forces, the Joint Planning Committee decided that it would be too risky to withdraw a UNITA battalion from Quang'er for the attack on Savate. The attack, therefore, would be undertaken by 3-2 Battalion alone. UNITA would merely occupy the town once it had been captured. To give the impression that this was an attack on Savate, by purely UNITA forces, no South African artillery or close air support would be provided. Once FAPLA had been driven from Savate, UNITA would occupy the town, and would prevent FAPLA from returning, and also cut off the FAPLA supply route to Quang'er. On 24 of April 1980, a South African Air Force Impala jet flew an air reconnaissance mission over Savate, from its base in Ondangwa. The aerial photograph analysts at Ondangwa identified a single trench system, and detected indications of an understrength FAPLA battalion in Savate. On the day of the attack, it was found that the main base complex had a double trench system, and other trenches and foxholes not visible on the air photo. This second trench system, and other trenches, were possibly dug after the air reconnaissance. They also found evidence of a small enemy deployment at the airfield, consisting of a group that protected what was interpreted from the aerial photographs to be the vehicle park. There was no indication of enemy advance posts on the roads north and south of Savate. UNITA intelligence confirmed these last two findings, but contradicted the aerial photograph analysts by reporting the presence of a company-strength enemy element at the base. It was estimated that, because of what was believed to be a relief process between brigades, because neither the South Africans nor UNITA were aware that 6th Brigade had earlier relieved 6th Brigade at Savate, a FAPLA force of about a company, approximately 150 men, would occupy the town at the time of the attack. The Savate Brigade was a light infantry brigade, with a strength of 1,260 soldiers of different ranks and appointments. Because the brigade was new, it was fully or close to fully staffed, and had most of the weapons and vehicles typical of a light infantry brigade. The brigade had deployed at least a company, 127 infantry, plus support elements, to each of its bases along the Angola-Namibia border, leaving the balance to defend Savate, conduct area patrols between the Cubango and Quito rivers, and to keep an eye on UNITA guerrilla activities west of Savate. The Dirico, Calais and Quangor bases were deserted. Where did the defenders go after the UNITA attacks? Chances are slim that they went to Mpupa, the only base still occupied. The Operation Tiro-Tiro planners never took in account that the enemy, who had fled from these towns, had consolidated at Care, because it was the only crossing over the Cubango River, and from there withdrew to Savate. The Joint Planning Committee therefore focused their plans for the attack on the trench system surrounding the kraals and town of Savate, as well as the military base between the airstrip and the town. To be safe, a decision was taken to send reconnaissance teams to Savate to determine, firstly, if the base was occupied at all, and, secondly, if so, the exact enemy strength. A signal was sent to Southwest Africa Territorial Force, explaining the plan, a reconnaissance followed by an attack, and requesting authority to execute. The reply, received by the Joint Planning Committee, was in Afrikaans: "Gaan voort met die work," proceed with the work. Both the 3-2 Battalion commander and the committee understood the message to indicate that he was to continue with the attack. The message to proceed had been incorrectly sent. The message that the staff officer in the operations room in Bastion had given to the signaler was "Gaan voort met die werk," werk being an Afrikaans abbreviation for verkenning, reconnaissance. As it was standard operating procedure that abbreviations were not allowed in top secret and operational messages, the signaler had apparently thought that the word werk was not an abbreviation, but was wrongly spelt, and should have been work. So, he sent the message "Gaan voort met die work," proceed with the work. Ordered to plan an attack, based on unconfirmed intelligence, that an understrength battalion held Savate, and occupied the base complex, the 3-2 Battalion commander done his planning. Commandant Ferreira planned to attack Savate, with 3 understrength rifle companies, relying on 2 mortar sections, 4 weapons, for indirect support fire, and the 3-2 Battalion Recce Wing, for ambush and stopper groups. He also planned to use 2 rifle platoons, for protection and reserve purposes, an assault pioneer section, and individual elements, from 1 company, for echelon protection and to assist with base clearance. The only other authorized support for the operation was provided by the South African Air Force Tactical Air Unit, later renamed 320 Air Force Command Post, in Rundu. The air support approved was 1 Alouette gunship, and 1 Puma helicopter for the evacuation of casualties only. Why the decision were taken to only have 1 gunship on standby is not clear, as this was not Air Force doctrine, as explained by Captain Johan Mertz, the gunship pilot.
Ons was net veronderstel die lugmag mag nie deelgeneem het nie, want dit is UNITA wat nou veronderstel was om die kamp aan te val. So ons was net daar vir 'n uiterste noodgeval. Ons lugmagdoktrine mag daar nooit minder minste 2 gunships oor die kaaplyn gaan as jy in 'n kontak betrokke raak. So dit was een van die gebreke gewees, maar dit was nooit so beplan dat ons sou betrokke wees.
A Cessna 185 was also available for command and control purposes. The helicopters were not permitted to overnight in Angolan territory. Instructions were clear, to limit the use of the helicopters to the absolute minimum, and to avoid making their presence known to the enemy. The Sector 20 operations room would be used to relay radio messages to Southwest Africa Territorial Force Windhoek. The attack would be led by Commandant Ferreira. Major Viljoen would man the tactical headquarters at the Omouni base, from where all the deployments would take place. The plan was that the mortar sections, commanded by Lieutenant Chris Brown, protected by 2 understrength Echo Company platoons, commanded by Lieutenant Dave Thompson, and Sergeants Russell Organ and Billy Fowle, would use 481mm mortars, with high explosive and white phosphorus bombs. They were to take up positions, approximately 2.5 to 3 kilometers, south of the base, along the north-south road, from where they would mount a pre-bombardment. Fowle would also mine the road south of Savate, preventing any interference from forces in that direction, as well as cutting off any enemy trying to flee the base. The Recce wing, led by 2nd Lieutenant Paul Garrett, was divided into 10 3 to 5-man groups, and would deploy north of Savate, to stop individuals of the enemy forces trying to escape towards Kayundo. Charlie Company, 63 strong, commanded by Lieutenant Sam Heap, would use 2 platoons to attack to be the vehicle park. The airstrip would form the border between Alpha and Charlie Companies. Alpha Company, 74 strong, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Muller, would attack the main base complex, situated to the north and around the Savate town complex, advancing from west to east, with the aim of pushing the enemy towards the Cubango River, leaving them little choice but to flee north towards Kayundo, about 135 kilometers away, the obvious escape route for the Savate defenders. Foxtrot Company, 74 strong, commanded by Lieutenant Jim Ross, would attack the southern part of the town and base complex. The 3rd Charlie Company platoon, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Andre Theron, was the reserve for the main assault force and, together with some men from Echo Company's 3rd platoon, and 9 men from Echo Company, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Rolf Heiser. They would walk in a spread-out line, behind the assault line, to attend to any wounded and take them to the medical point. A medical evacuation post would be set up by Lieutenant Dr. Richard Van Zale. This medical post would be near Commandant Ferreira's headquarters, on the road, forming the border between the Alpha and Foxtrot Company's attack force. Lieutenant Van Zale would be assisted by Lieutenant Dr. Stefan Bauer. Bauer had Corporal Grant Larkin, a trained South African Medical Service operational medic, to help him. Lieutenant Dr. Breet and Lieutenant Dr. Dunlop would man the Omouni sickbay, and would be responsible for treating casualties, who would be evacuated by helicopter. Company medical orderlies would support the medical teams. The Assault Pioneer Section, 12 soldiers, commanded by Lieutenant Coini Nolte, and Warrant Officer Class 2 Jose Lorenzo, would protect the echelon where Major Lou was in command. They would also help clear the base after the attack. The Air Force component, under the control of Major Day Lynch, would be stationed at the Omouni, on standby to evacuate casualties only. Preparations and rehearsals for the deployment started at Buffalo Base. All the companies were under strength to begin with, but, luckily, the January 1980 recruit intake finished training in time to make up the numbers. Most of the company's white leaders were either on leave or on courses in South Africa, and therefore had to be replaced with leaders from other companies. Fortunately, they were able to supplement the leader group with former Rhodesian servicemen who had arrived in the unit 2 weeks before and were busy with orientation training. Corporal Leon Grobler, Alpha Company Platoon 1, Alpha 1, remembers the preparations we prepared for the clandestine operation. All the South African marks had to be removed. We were supposed to be UNITA. We removed all marks on the mortars, grenades and boots. We had to cut the boot soles, in order not to leave South African tracks. We also received unmarked ammunition. All South African ammunition was marked R1M1. Also, our rations. No tins, papers, or anything that could be recognized. We listened to House of the Rising Sun many times. We practiced the attack at Buffalo. Long extended lines, fire and movement. On 15 of May, Commandant Ferreira briefed Lieutenant Willem Ratte, the Reconnaissance Wing commander, about their tasks. Captain Ratte and 2nd Lieutenant Justin Taylor, the battalion signals officer, responsible for confirming radio communication, returned to Omauni that same day to prepare 2 recce teams for the reconnaissance task. The Rundu Chief Staff Intelligence Field Office supply vehicles use a 2-track road from the border to supply the UNITA guerrillas at their Inhara Cape Bay base, and from there further north to Tanda, northwest of Savate. According to UNITA, there were a road running west from Savate joining this supply route. The axis of advance to the assembly point, to be recce by 2nd Lieutenant Opperman's team. Captain Ratte's team, 2nd Lieutenant Erwin Baumeister, Sergeant Pieter van Aden, Corporal Paulo Chivale, Corporal Pedro Casamo and a UNITA guide, had to do a reconnaissance on Savate base, to establish whether there was any enemy at Savate, their strength, and where they were in relation to the airstrip and the river. They also had to recce the mortar positions, and led the mortar group into position. They would also, from an observation post east of the Cubango River, give correction on the mortar bombardment. 2nd Lieutenant Stephanus Opperman team, 2nd Lieutenant Anthony Botes, Sergeant Cornelius Mare, Lance Corporal Kaliva, and Rifleman Kajabu, had to recce the route in for the attack group to the dispersal point. After the recce, this team would meet up with the assault force, where the reported east to west road from Savate joined the UNITA supply road, and lead them to the dispersal point. Once the assault force arrives at the dispersal point, the team would join the rest of the recce wing stopper groups. Early morning on 18 of May the Air Force component arrived at Omauni, and put on standby for the reconnaissance mission and for the rest of the attack. Staff Sergeant Lopez Francisco, known by 3-2 Battalion men as Senor Lobs, from the Rundu Field Office, and a UNITA guide, would meet the 2 recce teams at the border and from there, driving a UNITA vehicle, follows the supply route to their drop-off points. On 17 of May around midday, they first dropped 2nd Lieutenant Opperman's team at a point, according to Staff Sergeant Francisco, southwest of Savate, from where they would walk east for a certain distance, and then turn north, walking until they found the east to west road coming from Savate, and from there walk along the road to the proposed dispersal point. At 18:10 on 17 of May Staff Sergeant Francisco dropped Captain Ratte's team at a point, according to him, northwest of Savate, allowing them to walk east, until they reached the Cubango River north of Savate, where they would assemble their Klepper Arias kayaks, and paddle downstream to the target area. By the morning of 19 of May, 2nd Lieutenant Opperman had still not found the east to west road. They had walked until daybreak and still couldn't find the road. They started doing a 360, meaning you go 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer, making a square, to find the road. By 1300 that afternoon, they hadn't found anything, and had covered 40-odd kilometers and was without water and dehydrated. They radioed to Omauni, where the main fighting force was at that stage, explaining their predicament. They were told the Cessna 185 will be sent to locate their position. Early morning on 19 of May, Lieutenant Graham Chisholm, the pilot, and Major Eddie Vayoun searched for 2nd Lieutenant Opperman and his team. They flew much farther north than expected but could not find the men. Eventually, at 10:20, they established radio communication with 2nd Lieutenant Opperman, and determined his position as 7 kilometers southwest of Savate. The aircraft had flown to the west and near Savate, which were probably detected by the Savate defenders. The next day, at 0900, Captain Toons Meyer flew his Puma to pick up Opperman's exhausted and dehydrated team, and returned to the Omauni base, just in time for them to join the main force, which was to move shortly. Lieutenant Ratte's team started their journey eastwards towards the river, according to them about a 6-hour walk. They did not reach the river that first night, and so decided to find a layup place for the following day.
When we lay up during the day, we heard vehicle noises straight east, but we should have been north of the base. But hearing the noises coming straight east was a bit worrying. So we thought, oh well, we are definitely north because Mr. Lob said we are definitely north of the base. So it must be a vehicle convoy that's on the road to Savate. So I decided, well, rather than walk into the vehicle convoy that's lagering there, north of Savate, we'll veer off a bit to the south and then we launch our boats to the south of the vehicle convoy, but obviously still far north of Savate. So that's what we did. We got to the river at night, and to the river we launched, and we're now happily rowing south, thinking that we are now approaching Savate. On river, you don't really have to do much paddling. You just ease along, and it's quiet. And at one stage, we saw the elephants drinking on the side. You feel quite small. It was actually quite an experience. And one stage, we went through a rapid as well, and then we got to an old Portuguese village. I asked, and the UNITA guide, what was funny about the UNITA guide, he was never happy. He sort of, I said to him, we are north of Savate, where are we? How close are we to Savate? He couldn't put two and two together. He said he doesn't know. Then we got to this village. I said to him, well, you must know this village. So he said, okay, let's get out. So we beached the boats and we went, it was totally deserted. Not a single soul in the whole village. It was a very small village, few houses.
Lieutenant Rate's team were at the deserted village of Panda, approximately 6 kilometers south of Savate.
He said, we are south of Savate. That's the first time I realized we actually totally wrong. We've been rowing away from Savate. So then we jumped back into the boats and we started rowing upwards, upstream. The next night, we made it back to Savate, now coming from the south. And we came in, we put the boats, hid the boats away on the eastern side.
Weer noord geroei, en tussentyd is ons klepper al onder die water gewees, ons het ons groot radio verloor, en ons noord toe geroei. Ons het toe die, seker omtrent op weer 2-3 die oggend eers by Savate uitgekom. En toe ons daar stop het Willem gesê, ek moet uitklim en net kyk of ek iets kan sien daar. Ons het hulle waai gehoor daar. Ek het met die nagsig gekyk, toe sê ek, dit lyk soos Johannesburg se ligte.
And then we waited for a while until noise had died down. And then we went and did the reconnaissance, because based up on the other side of the river, and then rode across around about midnight or after midnight. I had to go all around the perimeter of the base and find out if it's occupied. That was their main concern, is the base occupied, and more or less how many people were there. So he went on his task and I went on mine, worked my way all around the base onto the airstrip, and it was definitely occupied. There was a lot of chattering and a lot of fires and a lot of troops, and got to the airstrip. And from the airstrip I walked down, back to the river.
When Lieutenant Rate had completed his circuit of the base, he confirmed the deployment of FAPLA forces, in and around the town. Their strength was much more than a battalion. He also noted extensive conventional trench, and underground bunker systems, and confirmed a strong deployment of 14.5 mm anti-aircraft guns at the airfield, that the aerial photograph analysts had supposed was a vehicle park.
En ons is toe terug net so 100 meter suid in digte rietbos, en ek is suid na die mortierstellings toe, en ek het toe nader aan daar gesit, ek en die UNITA gist, dit het toe begin lig word en die voertuie het begin by ons verbykom, en ek het toe vir Willem laat weet, ek kan nie langer daar bly nie, hulle gaan ons sien, want dit was afgebrand. En ek en die UNITA gids is toe af na die kleppers toe, waarvan ek en Willem en die rest van die span oor kan die rivier gegaan het.
Because their B-22 high-frequency radio, being submerged and underwater during their rowing through the rapids, Lieutenant Rate could not contact Commandant Ferreira to inform him of his recce results. He hoped that once the attack force was nearer to Savate, he could reach Commandant Ferreira with his A-52 very high-frequency radio. Also, even though he had realized that the UNITA supply route was wrongly plotted, and were actually more than 20 kilometers to the west of where UNITA said it was, they could not inform Commandant Ferreira, who would lead the assault force on the same route. Staff Sergeant Francisco had dropped 2nd Lieutenant Opperman's team, about 7 kilometers south of the planned dropping point. Lieutenant Rate's team were dropped directly west, and in line with Savate. The vehicle movement they heard was not north of Savate but inside Savate. Commandant Ferreira could wait no longer. At 14:15 on 19 of May, the 370 company men, the mortar sections, the assault pioneer section, and the support elements left for Savate on Quevol trucks. Commandant Ferreira's small command element, which included his intelligence officer, Captain Andre Erasmus, Regimental Sergeant Major Uckerman, Signals Officer 2nd Lieutenant Taylor, Signaler Lance Corporal Bruce Anders, Operations Clerk Lance Corporal Loebscher, Lieutenants, Doctors Van Zale and Bauer, and Lieutenant Charles Muller, who was responsible for navigation, and most of the recce wing men, traveled in 4 buffles. Each buffle was armed with a 7.62 mm mounted Browning machine gun, and manned by a recce wing man. The other recce wing men traveled on one of the Quevol trucks. Captain Johan Liu controlled the 7 Quevol trucks, on which the companies traveled. Sergeant Pete Norquia was tasked with ammunition resupply during the battle and had one 10-ton Quevol, loaded with ammunition and supplies. When the road, which was supposed to have been reconnoitered by 2nd Lieutenant Opperman, that ran towards Savate was reached, the force would debus and advance on foot towards the base. All the planning was based on the assumption that the assault force would reach the debus point long before last light on 20th of May. The navigation of the main assault force to the assembly point was once again left to Staff Sergeant Francisco, who confirmed that he knew the route, and insisted that he had dropped the recce teams at the correct locations. By 2200 on 19 of May, the assault force had still not reached their assembly point. Commandant Ferreira realized that Francisco had taken them past Savate, and that they were actually at Chana dos Elefantos, 16 kilometers northwest of Savate. The assault force had traveled on the UNITA supply route, which was wrongly plotted by UNITA. Commandant Ferreira had no choice but to logger south of Chana dos Elefantos that night. Early the next day, he tasked Major Villun and Captain Chisholm with an aerial reconnaissance of the route, so he could decide where they should go next. Flying out of earshot and sight of Savate, or so they thought, they scouted the route they would later direct the convoy to. Knowing that he was falling behind schedule, Commandant Ferreira decided to travel in daylight, and left Chana dos Elefantos at 1400 on 20 of May, moving south. When they were west-southwest of Savate, Chisholm, who was still airborne, guided the convoy towards the correct road. 15 kilometers from Savate they found it. Half overgrown and running from Savate, it stopped in the bush with no junction with any existing road, except for 2 track roads disappearing north and south into yet more bush. Meanwhile, the Chief Staff Intelligence Liaison Team commanded by Commandant Marius Ilshig, arrived by light aircraft at Omauni. Commandant Ilshig was accompanied by Major Johan Schutte, his logistics officer, who was to determine the nature and scope of logistics requirements, so that UNITA would be able to remain operationally functional in the area, once FAPLA had been driven out of Savate. Another team member, Major José de Oliveira, was interested in finding or identifying elements from Savate, who would be willing to provide information regarding FAPLA military activities in the area. The plan was for the Chief Staff Intelligence Team to fly with the Puma to Savate after the attack. However, when it became apparent that he would need to liaise with the UNITA forces, which would deploy north and south of Savate, to coordinate times, Commandant Ferreira ordered Commandant Ilshig and his team to be flown by helicopter to his position. Ilshig would then accompany Ferreira's force, traveling on Staff Sergeant Francisco's 2-ton Fiat truck. The assault force convoy followed the road to the assembly point, 9 kilometers from Savate, reaching it at around 1900 on 20 of May. The plan was for the echelon vehicles, empty Quevol trucks and buffles, to stay at the assembly point under Captain Liu's and Sergeant Norquia's command. While the recce team were conducting their reconnaissance, Ferreira's headquarters group, Van Zale's medical team, the assault force, the mortars with 2 platoons of Echo Company, and the remaining recce teams, were preparing to move on foot to the dispersal point west of Savate. From here, the mortar and protection platoons would move to their setup place south of the town. The moment the bombardment on Savate started, the empty vehicles, the assault pioneer section, divided among the 4 buffles, under the command of Sergeant Ron Gregory, and the echelon were to move to the outskirts of the enemy base, where a second medical evacuation post under Lieutenant, Dr. Bauer, and an echelon area under Captain Liu would be established. Casualty evacuation and ammunition resupply to the companies would be done from this point. Casualties would first be treated by Dr. Van Zale at a medical point near Commandant Ferreira's headquarters, before being moved to Dr. Bauer's post for further attention. Preparations were done at the debussing point. The company commanders again confirmed the attack plan with their men. The assault force men, dressed in combat kit, were given one 81mm mortar bomb each to carry, to help the mortar platoon move the 300-odd mortar bombs to the dispersal point. From there, the mortar crews and Echo Company platoons would have to carry their 4 mortar tubes, as well as at least 3 mortar bombs per man. The backpacks belonging to the company men were stacked on the Quavol trucks, to be redistributed in the echelon area after the attack. As the recce teams would have to stay in the vicinity of their stopper group positions after the attack as an early warning element, they took their heavy backpacks with them. At 2100 on 20 of May, on time to reach the target before first light, the assault force started their march towards Savate. Walking in a prearranged order would allow for quick separation once they reached the dispersal point. Charlie Company led in single file, walking on the left, north, of the road, followed by battalion headquarters, the recce teams and the mortar sections. Alpha Company led on the right, south, of the road, followed by Foxtrot Company. Not known to Commandant Ferreira, the Savate defenders had heard the aircraft earlier the day. Also, there were a control point on the advance axis, who reported the vehicle movement. When the vehicle movement did not come closer to Savate, Sergeant Daniel Jorge Ernesto, from the Reconnaissance Company, were sent to see where the noises had stopped. The attack force was walking to the dispersal point when at 22:30, when Sergeant Ernesto's vehicle approached from the front.
It was very, very dark. There was no moon, and we really had a problem in navigating this two-spur road. At times, we really had to walk about a meter apart, touching each other, so that we could just follow the route and not veer off the route. At the stage, we heard a vehicle approaching from the eastern side towards where we were walking towards Savate. And we could hear that the vehicle was, or a vehicle or vehicles were coming closer and closer. We reported it back to the headquarters, and we were all instructed to get off the road on the northern side, all of us on the northern side of the road, and that we had to let the vehicles or vehicle come past, but we had to report in what we saw when they came past us. Initially we were told that we must not ambush the vehicle there at the beginning. They would do it at the center of the formation. The vehicle passed us, and the vehicle had lights on. You could see the dust hanging in the air where we had been walking, and I was very worried that these people would come to the conclusion that there is something in this road. But all right, it was late at night and they went past us.
So while we were walking in that night, we became aware that there was movement on the front already, and we heard vehicles coming down the sand track towards us. So Jim and I were taking the lead. Foxtrot Company was in front, and Jim gave the command, immediate ambush to the left. I clearly remember the whole battalion going off on the left, ambush position. But as the two vehicles came closer, the troops became nervous, and they moved back and back and back further away from the road, and Jim and I followed, because we were afraid that if we stayed in front, they would shoot volleys over us to the vehicles. But at some stage, we ended up so far from the road that we could not effect the ambush anymore. So we gave the command to the troops to hold their fire, and the two of us crept forward again, leopard crawled, and waited about 10 meters from the road. And as the two trucks passed us, I can't remember Gas or Ural, we had decided Jim will take the front one, I will take the second one. So we got up, firing position, and took them out. First took the drivers out, then took the engines out and bring the trucks to a standstill in the ambush.
The advance continues. Everybody was extremely tired from the heavy weight they had to carry. Everybody was nervous because of the surprise element being given away. Then the force walked into a very dense bush. After battling for about 30 minutes through the Hawk and Steek, everybody's arms and faces were covered in bloody scratches. Lieutenant Heap asked Commandant Ferreira if they could wait until daybreak, so that they could see where they were going through the dense bush. He agreed. Everybody went down in his tracks, lying or just sitting, waiting for first light. During this time, Lieutenant Rate had been trying to reach Commandant Ferreira on the A52 VHF radio, but to no avail. Just before first light the force continued their advance, and reached the dispersal point. The mortar bombardment was supposed to start at 0:00 on 21 of May, but the first bombs were not fired until 0900. When the mortar bombardment started, the recce teams were at the road and started dispersing from there.
We can go back now to the dispersal point. So everybody is alluded to the fact that we were actually carrying a lot of mortar. So when we got to the dispersal point about 4:30 in the morning, we put down all the additional mortars we had carried. And between Echo and the mortar platoon, they picked up those additional mortars. That's now on top of the launchers, the base plates, the bipods, the sights, everything that the mortar gunner carries. And they made off to the south with Echo Company to go and get into position for launch at first light. In the meantime, we split up. The Foxtrot Company, of which I was part, split to the south, the 3 platoons. The other platoons went to the north, and it was Alpha Company directly on the northern side of the road, and then Charlie Company a bit further on. And we waited for the command to advance. But we had to wait for the mortars, and UNITA at that time had to join us. So I recall Jim telling me, because I was in the middle platoon, Foxtrot 17, Jim sat with his back against a tree in my vicinity, and he said, UNITA is not joining. And so the colonel has decided that we are going on. The commandant has decided that we will continue on our own. They will join later. There we sat, and then the sun rose. Now this is a bad time for an attack. Remember now the sun in the east shone over their backs into our eyes, which is not the ideal position for an attack in the first place. On top of that, I started picking up movement ahead of us. There was some of their, let me call it reconnaissance group, moving out of the trenches looking for us, and they saw us and we saw them, but we were not ready to start the attack. And then the mortar platoon opened fire.
The mortar bombardment was supposed to start at 0:00 on 21 of May, but the first bombs were not fired until 0900.
The mortar group consisted of mostly ex-wounded company guys that was getting better, so they weren't used to carrying so much at that stage. So we really battled to keep up with the movement. But some of the guys, as they were tiring, couldn't keep up, so it was a concertina effect all the time. Our movement was really slow. Even Echo Company also battled with all the mortar bombs. We got to where we were supposed to meet the reconnaissance guy that was to show us where the mortar position were. We couldn't meet up at all, so we had to make do with our own position. We walked to the edge of the Shana. We thought we were set up just on the bush line, and we marked. We started making our calculations on the bombardment. Echo Company, Billy Fall and Russell Organ went forward to the road where they planted some mines because we thought there might be coming some vehicles. We arrived at the mortar position about 9:15. We set up base plates and everything, and unfortunately we started late because of all the problems with the movement. Our first bombs, when we started the bombardment at 9 o'clock, the first bombs were very far off, but luckily the reconnaissance group, Willem and then were on top of a hill where they could have where they had a very good view of the base, and they did the corrections for us.
When the mortar bombardment started, the recce teams were at the road and started dispersing from there. The attack force lay in position, waiting for the mortar bombardment to stop and for the signal to attack.
We were waiting, and a few minutes into the bombardment, I hear a very strange noise. Something like zoom, zoom, zoom. And I asked the troops, what's it? What is that noise? And then they said, it's the Monikashita. So that was now the Stalin organ. And they started the bombardment, the counter-bombardment, and that was quite intensive.
FAPLA delivered a counter-bombardment with 122mm Mono Katyusha rocket launchers and 82mm mortars towards the mortars and the attack force. A FAPLA light infantry brigade had 4 of these type of weapons. Because the planners were unaware that a brigade occupies Savate, nobody expected Mono Katyushas at Savate. When the assault started, there was still no communication from Lieutenant Ratte, so Commandant Ferreira decided to send Major Vayun with the Cessna 185 to try to reach him. For the second time, Lieutenant Chisholm would fly unplanned and continue for most of the day. Via the Cessna, Lieutenant Ratte managed to make contact with Commandant Ferreira on the A-52 radio, and informed him that Savate was much bigger and stronger than expected. But it was too late to stop, the bombardment was in progress, and the attack force was advancing towards the base. A FAPLA light infantry brigade strength were 1,260 in total. Most of these men were in Savate because they had fled from their bases along the Kuvango River. When the advance began, it was clear that the mortar bombardment had not had the desired effect of keeping the enemy's heads down, and giving the assault force time to reach their positions. FAPLA were waiting for them, before letting loose with their arsenal of weapons.
I remember Colonel Ferreira coming up on the radio and said, guys, stand up, move to contact. And we hadn't moved 200-300 meters, we were in contact. Now, although the base was only supposed to be 1.5 kilometers from there, the main trenches, we were fighting from the first moment because they had foxholes outside of the base. So every foxhole was a fight. We had to take that way and actually kill that guy before we could move on. So we expended ammunition at a rate like nothing before. I remember I had carried the R1. I never believed in an AK. I wanted firepower. I carried 10 magazines and 5 spare boxes of ammunition. And I had shot out my last magazine, and the hand grips of my R1 had melted off. I held it with my bush hat before we even saw the trenches. So we were in a serious fight before we started.
And we received the order to attack 10 o'clock. As far as I can remember it. But the fire was immense. I never experienced anything like that. We moved forward, Alpha Company, and Dave Hodgson on the left side, myself on the right-hand side, Dave next to the runway. But everything, as far as to my understanding, it was in order. Charles Miller, our company commander, was a very proficient officer. And he was so relaxed. It's like, he said, all stations down. But then when the fire was too intense, then we shoot back and the normal drills. Then as soon as you start shooting back, lying down, the fire lift. And then Charles Miller said, all stations forward, but so relaxed. At one stage, I hear an enormous explosion next to me. And we all took dekking, And Charles Miller said all stations forward, carry on with the attack, but unknown to me, one of my troops was killed in that explosion. He was just next to me.
The UNITA guerrillas deployed between Quang'er and Savate either did not deploy or did not do their work when the bombardment started to prevent FAPLA interference from the south or, more likely, from the forward post that Lieutenant Rattay had come across.
At that stage, a convoy was coming from the south as well, and it was consisting of 3 gas vehicles with troops at the back. We ceased fire at that stage so that the convoy could pass. They didn't hit the landmines. I think they veered off to another track.
What was to have been an easy run for Charlie Company turned out to be a nightmare. They were formed up north of the runway, which marked the border between Charlie and Alpha companies.
Platoons and myself, we were in the normal attack formation that we used, a stretched out line, and we moved very cautiously. The trees, there wasn't much cover. There were thin trees and small bushes all along the route. And although we couldn't see very far, you could see about maybe 50 to 100 meters in front of you. We were advancing very carefully and slowly in the normal manner when suddenly we drew fire. Okay, we went over in the normal fire and movement mode where we do buddy, and I could hear the platoons. I was in the center of the 2 platoons. I could hear them calling and doing the normal shouting, moving forward. And we had advanced about, I would say, around about 100 meters or so, when the platoon commanders reported to me on the radio that they already had encountered some casualties. I told the people to stop the advance and that we just could have a look, because at that stage we still haven't seen or encountered the enemy on face value. We couldn't see them, but there was a lot of firing. I then realized, and we then realized that there was much bigger weapons being used against us than the normal machine guns and AK-47s. We realized it should have been, or it must have been, 14.5s that were being used in the ground roll. As you could see, that the trees and the small trees next to us, they were just chopped down in size. So as I said, we still couldn't see. We still hadn't seen the enemy or their trenches at that stage. I think there was about 4 or 5 of the troops, of my troops, that were already had injuries. Fortunately, not one of them had died at that stage yet. I wanted to report to Falcon the situation, to tell him that our advance was being hampered by heavy caliber weapons, but I couldn't get hold of him on the radio. They had already started the main attack on the southern side of the airstrip, and I think he was involved because he had a radio that could talk to the companies, and he had a ground air radio with him, and I think with all the noise and everything, he didn't hear me. But eventually I got hold of Major Viljoen, the second in command. He was in a Bosbok in the air, and I told him that we had really had problems in advancing, and that the enemy strength was too heavy for us to move forward. He eventually spoke to Falcon, and Falcon gave me the order that I had to withdraw and go to the Echelon area should I be needed to come forward and strengthen the main attack force.
What on the aerial photographs had been interpreted as a vehicle park was in fact the Savate air defense position. During the initial planning phase of Operation Tiro-Tiro, no one had thought that the runway at Savate was functional, and that FAPLA would defend it. A FAPLA light infantry brigade had 6 of these weapons. The enemy forces from the Charlie Company objective were now attacking Alpha Company from the north. Alpha 3 platoon was formed up on the road. However, What Alpha Company commander was not aware of, was that when the advance started, the right flank of the company veered to the left, and a gap opened between 2nd Lieutenant Bob Still and Corporal Adi Ristoff's Alpha 3 platoon, and 2nd Lieutenant Heinz Muller and Corporal Abel Stoltz Foxtrot 16 platoon. Commandant Ferreira and his command group were next to the road, and unaware that because of the gap which opened, they were now exposed to direct enemy fire. When the gap opened between Alpha 3 and Foxtrot 16, the enemy saw an opportunity to counterattack, and a group penetrated through this gap and was now attacking the companies from behind. Because of the gap in the attack line left by Alpha 3 platoon veering left, 2nd Lieutenant Heinz Muller's Foxtrot 16 now also engaged the enemy on Alpha Company's right flank. The same enemy was also attacking the headquarters. Possibly because of the topography of the area, very high-frequency radio communication between the platoons began to intermittently break down, and for long periods it was impossible to speak to one another. 2nd Lieutenant Andrew Olivier from Foxtrot 18 had an easy advance. They missed the trenches and were advancing on the Kimbo complex to the south of the trench system. They only sporadically shot at individual enemies. When they reached the town's main road, they swept towards the FAPLA headquarters building. Major Lynch made the decision to take the Puma and gunship closer to the battlefront, in case they were needed for casualty evacuation, and landed at the Echelon and medical post. He also arrived with the helicopters, so that he could better coordinate air support, if needed. The assault force was progressing slowly, and taking heavy casualties, which had not been anticipated. When Lieutenant Heap had to regroup, a gap opened in the line, and soon some enemy appeared behind the assault force and between the Echelon vehicles. After about 2 hours, however, their fire started to slacken and their resistance showed less resolve. They stayed in the trenches, and did not launch a frontal counterattack but instead used small groups to attack. From his observation post, Lieutenant Ratte reported a group of enemy, moving on foot to the north along the road. Some of them were carrying Mono Katyusha rocket launchers. This group would most probably walk north, and mount the rocket launchers to bombard the assault force. The launchers were useless firing from their original positions in the base, because of the short distance between them and the assault force. It was becoming increasingly difficult for Commandant Ferreira to control the assault, as the headquarters protection element regularly had to physically take part in the assault, because of the numbers of enemy they encountered. 2nd Lieutenant Taylor and Captain Erasmus were for a moment on their own firing at the enemy, but they made it back to the protection of Lieutenant Theron's platoon, before Captain Erasmus was killed in a firefight not far from Commandant Ferreira.
En toe ons opgeskiet met raak toe heeltemal stil. By ons, jy hoor die ander geveg aan. Niemand skiet met, dit het net stil geraak. En toe met kaptein Erasmus en ons offisier effens vorentoe gekom en ons gevra, waarom gaan julle nie vorentoe nie? Hy sê, ons kan nie vorentoe gaan as ons nie mag skiet nie. Want ons kan dit, nou raak het so 350 meter na die basis. Dan jy kan die loopgrawe sien en daar het so trooper voertuig gestaan, net agter die, en hy het hom met hulle ook gesien, die PKM in hom gehad, wat op ons geskiet het. Toe hy kom hoor, wat gaan aan? Toe is hy nou, want die rest van ons is so 6 duim onder die grond, want hulle skiet op. En toe hy evens vorentoe kom, dus hy natuurlijk, dus skiet op, van my af, dit skijns achter my.
Moments later, Commandant Ferreira's headquarters came under mortar bombardment. He contacted Major Lynch, requesting the Puma to evacuate the casualties, and the Cessna to assist with radio communication. Sergeant Pete Norquia arrived with the ammunition vehicle at Commandant Ferreira's headquarters, which by now had moved slowly forward behind the Alpha Company advance line, and was situated near a Soviet amphibious pontoon, standing behind the first trenches. At 1450, before Sergeant Norquia could start distributing ammunition, the mortar bombardment on the headquarters began. Commandant Ferreira instructed people from the company to load the seriously wounded onto the ammunition vehicle and another vehicle that Captain Liu had sent to the front to take them to Lieutenant Bauer's medical post for treatment. Sergeant Norquia loaded while the mortar rounds fell, and drew some rocket-propelled grenade, RPG-7 and small arms fire too. Commandant Ferreira shouted to get the ammunition vehicle out of danger. He managed to get it away from the bombardment, and later returned to Commandant Ferreira's position. Commandant Ferreira then decided to bring the Puma forward, to evacuate the casualties, and instructed Sergeant Norquia to go with the vehicle to prepare a landing zone. Following standard operating procedures, the Alouette gunship pilot, Captain Johann Mertz, and his flight engineer, Flight Sergeant Leon Becker, first had to secure the landing zone, before Captain Meyer's Puma could land, guided from the open door by his own flight engineer, Flight Sergeant Siegfried Hobel.
Ek het toe gegaan en die plek, ek moes die LZ beveilig vir die Puma want hy is mos nie bewapen nie. En daar's toe redelik op ons geskiet. En ek dink as 'n RPG-7 is op my geskiet, maar hy is hier onder die helikopter deur.
Unfortunately, the Puma overshot the landing zone, and had to make a wide turn over Savate, and was fired at by the 14.5mm gun at the airfield that was still active. FAPLA had not fired at the gunship initially, but when the Puma overshot the landing zone, it turned near the gun's position and the crew started to fire, though not accurately because of the distance. Captain Meyer, keeping his instructions in mind, could not risk the Puma being hit. Because of the same restrictions, the gunship could not engage the anti-aircraft weapon. Commandant Ferreira called on the mortars to silence the 14.5mm gun. With the gun silenced, the Puma landed at the evacuation point. Lieutenant Bauer took medical supplies to Lieutenant Van Zale, and because of the situation, decided to accompany the Puma, which would just offload the casualties at Omauni base and then return to the battlefield. When the helicopters flew onto the battlefield, the FAPLA commander, who was still in the trenches on the eastern side of the base, must have realized that they were under attack by South Africans. It was reported to Commandant Ferreira that Lieutenant Muller and some other men were missing. At 16:20, Lieutenant Ratte reported 9 FAPLA vehicles, accompanied by many troops on foot leaving the base going north. At Commandant Ferreira's request, Captain Chisholm and Major Villune took off from Omauni to be air observers. Commandant Ferreira also called the 4 Buffles under Sergeant Gregory's control, each mounted with a 7.62mm Browning machine gun, to his command post. There was no chance that Commandant Ferreira would allow the enemy to escape, in all likelihood taking the missing 32 Battalion soldiers with them. It was now almost 7 hours since the attack had started, and the recce teams encountered a huge group of fleeing FAPLA.
What happened was a whole column broke away and started coming towards our position, with just myself and Fritz and my machine gunner Alberto. And our machine gunner Alberto was shot fairly early in the firefight, so we didn't have any a real machine gun cover. It was just Fritzie and I. Fritzie had the Snortneus, which was the M71 Snortneus little grenade launcher, and he was firing that, and I was firing the AK. And I remember we were underneath a tree, and the river was directly on the side here. It's almost like an embankment so we were a bit sheltered, but from all the bullets and the ricochet and everything, it was like rain, just all branches and leaves and everything falling down on us. And I contemplated on maybe even getting into the river at one point in time, because I thought, no, there's no ways that we're going to survive this. In the meantime, Fritzie went around and went and summoned help. As I said, Space Monkey, we call him Space Monkey, it's Alberto, because he got a nickname, that was his nickname that we gave him. And he was shot early, so we called in the choppers at that point in time for the extraction of him. But he passed away before the choppers could get to him. And then it was like a duck shoot. Everybody was just running after the guys, piling out of vehicles, and we were just, shooting at the guys.
Second Lieutenant Garrett instructed the other teams not to engage in the contact at the river, but to start with a flank attack on the enemy, with the vehicles breaking out on the eastern side. This would give Sergeant Fitzgerald's team a chance to make a clear breakaway.
Besluit om 'n flankaanval te loods, want daar baie vuur uitgebreek by Fritsie en Pierre Lipman op die kant en Space Monkey wat daar was. So laat ons hulle kan druk ontlig en al die ouens het begin hardloop vinnig van die kant af. En jy kon sien die formasie kom aan soos hy stap. Op die regterkant almal die formasie is opgebreek want die ouens hardloop uit spanne. Party ouens hardloop vinniger as ander en van die spanne as jy afgaan met die lyn is nou verder terug. En ek kan duidelik onthou, dit was aanvanklik of hierdie ouens nie gesien het nie. En klein Swannies het gehardloop reg, ek kon hom duidelik in die hoek van my oog uit sien. En ek het nie nodig gehad om daai tyd te hardloop nie, want ek was die tweede of die derde span, maar hulle kom van ver af en hulle moes hardloop. En klein Swannie het sy AK opgetel en hy het geskiet. Ek kan nie onthou wat die rede was en hoekom nie, maar toe hy daar skiet, toe slaat ons almal dek basies. Toe begin hulle terugskiet. En toe begin ons kontak maak met die FAPLA's. En daar's baie meer as ons, en ons is geïsoleer, and Peter pick up the gunfight on the left. We was about maybe I would say 700 meters to his right hand side. And when I saw the guys coming, and they were in a box formation and the vehicles, and I realized our vehicles didn't have cameras. And it was a lot of vehicles, like a lot. And my initial assessment, that's a battalion-sized force coming down along the river, and we will be overrun. So the order was given, like I explained a little before, to make an attack. And so we started an attack. But the problem was that every team was 400 meters apart, spread over the river, from the river, over the road, that way, to the other side, more to the eastern side. So a lot of the guys had to run very far. So we would start swinging, and while we were swinging, the guys were focusing on the contact with Fritzie and Peter. And we heard also the news that they were in trouble at that stage. So we start running, and we ran slower, and the guys on the other side had to catch up very fast. So we engaged when Swanee started firing. But the moment Swanee fired, we fall flat in the tall grass. We were still about 500 meters to help Fritzie. So we were firing over a long distance. But there was no time to fire initially. The grass roots on top of us were shot off. We was lying in the grass, myself, Kevin, and our machine gunner. The grass sprinkles falls down. So we wait for the other guys, and we start fighting back as much as possible. So when the other guys start doing fire and movement, and we wait for them. So we were separated in two groups, on our side, on the right-hand side now, attacking the flank of the battalion side force coming out. So the guys will start fighting, but one group on the far right-hand side were far behind. So we moved, and we stay in a fire space. I ran down, I helped them come up, because we was afraid that the fire arcs would cross. So we wait for them, they catch up. And then there was a problem in the long grass, we couldn't see. So we were firing a lot, but you can't see, and you don't get effective fire. So you need to come up. So Billy Boats got with the idea, let's start throwing phosphorus grenades in the grass. That's where the fire started. So when we start getting a lot of fire, in the fire and movement is over a long distance, it's like a couple of hundreds of meters. I can remember at one stage my throat was so sore for the fire and movement. I came there was a pool of water, and I grabbed the water and drank the water, and Piet van Eden and Willem and the three thought I got hit because I fall down. They reported like that, but I only drank water. And then we start throwing the phosphor grenades, and the wind was in our favor. So the fire came, we throw a couple of phosphor grenades, and we start moving directly behind the fire, and we start picking a lot of guys off. But it was like Fritzie said, there was not one contact, it was a continuous contact up to the river. Luckily we had a lot of ammunition. I think each guy had in the vicinity of 600 rounds or so we could sustain the fire, and every three-man team had a machine gun. And eventually we came to the site, but it was very clear that we start getting in big trouble.
I was part of the group that actually had to lay an ambush along the road. And the rest of the stopper groups were dispersed between the river and the road. With me was Stefanus Opperman, Billy Boats, and then my direct commander, stick leader at that point in time, was a guy called Eric Rabi. So we set up there, and our job was to make sure if any vehicles came up, we were to take them out. And that's obviously why I was deployed with them, because I had the anti-tank weapon. We then saw the vehicles starting to move along the river, and they were kind of bumping along because it was rough terrain. They'd obviously figured out if they came up the road, they were going to get nailed. I didn't have the benefit of having a radio. Eric Robbie had the radio, so he knew what was going on. But I saw all these vehicles, and I had this anti-tank weapon, and I was chomping at the bit to get down there, because we were I estimate it was about 1 kilometer from the road to the river where they were going along. And I was chomping to get down there and start drilling these guys with this anti-tank weapon. But Eric Robbie said to me, Gavin, you stay here, you don't not move. And in my brain I'm thinking, should I disobey a direct order, or should I get my ass down there and let these guys have it? But sanity prevailed, and now I figured out he had received instructions because of Sean Miller that we're not allowed to let anything get past, and that's why he probably wanted to make sure that we kept the firepower on the road. Anyway, Billy Boats and Oppies were with me, and they decided to go. And Eric said to me, Gavin, you stay here. So off they went, and I had to stay. But I was bleating because I wanted to get into it. And eventually, Eric let me go.
Absolutely amazing. I mean, they were just pouring towards us, and we were just shooting these oaks like, eh?
It was like movies.
It was like movies, up
in the deep ground. We were with talking to Gav Veenstra and what was happening.
And then you and I were running down that convoy. I mean, this comes out of a movie. It comes out of a movie. Mark and I are running down the convoy and just shooting the convoy grenades. I mean, it was amazing. The whole thing of vehicles, we just running down. Mark, you remember, you know I remember. Running, I'm just shooting at them.
We didn't know what to do. It was like, what do we do now? Go shoot the vehicles.
So Mark and I said, stuff this boy, off we went.
One important
Once again, Commandant Ferreira approached Major Lynch to help stop the fleeing enemy. Captain Mertz was subsequently told to do whatever was necessary to slow down the escaping FAPLA convoy, and allow the reserve buffels to reach Ferreira and catch up with the retreating FAPLA.
Ek en my ingenieur Boertjie Bekker het toe gegaan en ek het toe besluit om bietjie hoër as normaalig het ons op sê 600 na 800 voet die vyand aangevat, maar want dan is die 20 mm kanon op sy meeste effektiefste en jy is redelik veilig teen kleingeweervuur. Maar nietemin ek het toe ek die omvang van die konvooi sien, het ek besluit om bietjie hoër te klim sodat die kleingeweervuur gevaar geminimaal is, maar in gehoop hulle gaan nie hulle lugafweerkanonne as hulle dit saamgevat het gebruik op ons nie. Want eerstens is nie gewens as jy 2 is dan split jy die aandag. As jy 1 is dan is al die aandag op jou. Daarom het ek vir die ouens gevra, hulle vir my sê as ek geweervuur trek. En toe het hulle, toe ons daar oor hulle gaan, sê hulle nee, jy nou het gesê in die boek, dit klink soos 'n papier wat uit 'n boek geskeur word, soos hulle geskiet het. En maar ons het toe op die voorkant van die konvooi se voertuie geskiet en gelukkig het dit gewerk, want hulle het dadelik gestop, van die voertuie afgeklim en die bissies die riete langs die rivier in gaan wegtrek. En dan het ek, omdat hulle nou gestop het, wat my opdrag was om te doen, het ek dan bietjie noord gaan sirkel, om hulle te ontmoedig om nou verder te ry. Maar sodra ons bietjie weggaan, dan klim hulle weer op die voertuie en dan begin hulle weer ry. En toe dan begin ons nou weer skiet op hulle. Dan klim hulle weer af en dan gaan hulle in die riete in. En so, ek kan nie presies onthou hoeveel keer het hierdie patroon omgevolg nie. En op 'n stadium, toe ons oor hulle vlieg, toe word die vliegtuig nou die Elowet raak geskiet. Dit was Elowet 110 geweest. Hy word toe raak geskiet deur 'n paar rondes. Ek weet nie dan nie, want dit is net tot stof en hierdie slag. En jy weet nie wat se kaliber vuur dit was nie. In elk geval. En Ek was nog besig om my mind op te maak wat om my volgende te doen toe hoor ek tussen die 3-2 bataljoene by hulle voete gekom en hulle is besig om hierdie konvooi aan te vat.
From monitoring the FAPLA brigade radio network, it became evident that the brigade commander was busy with a full-scale withdrawal, leaving Savate in the hands of 32 Battalion. In the meantime, the 4 Buffles reached Commandant Ferreira's headquarters. Lieutenant Heap, Commandant Ferreira, 2nd Lieutenant Taylor, RSM Uckerman and Lieutenant Ross, with some Charlie Company troops, mounted the vehicles and gave chase, arriving at the convoy the moment the gunship broke away to return to Omauni.
Falcon gave the instruction that we had 4 Buffles on our force, that the 4 Buffles must move forward and that we should follow up on the column that was fleeing in a northwards position. I know that Falcon was in 1 Buffle. I think some Major Ickerman was with him. I was in a 2nd Buffle, and then Jim Ross, the company commander of Foxtrot Company, was in another Buffle. Who commanded the 4th Buffle, I am not sure. We went into a formation, a spread out formation from the road towards the river on the floodplain, and we moved northwards. There was also an Alouette gunship on the northern side that we could hear him firing on the vehicles as well as the recce's that was deployed there. They were cutting off the stopper groups. On the floodplains itself, I was the Buffle in the center there. I think Jim Ross was on the river side. I was more to the center and Falcon on the road. But we could see hundreds and hundreds of FAPLA trying to flee. They didn't want to stay on the roads. I think that's the people, or they might have got off the vehicles when the vehicles were ambushed by the recce's. But we just saw hundreds of people running towards the river and running towards the north, and also trying to hide in the grass. And that is where we really encountered, I would call it a duck shoot. We were in the vehicles, the people were running next to the vehicles or hiding in the grass, and we were just shooting the FAPLAs as they were running. Nobody was firing back at us. I think they were just trying to get away from us. There was an incident. We all had machine guns mounted on our Buffles, Brownings. Later on, their ammunition was finished. We all had all AKs or FNs with us, and our ammunition was finished. So as soon as you shot someone, you jump off, you take his weapon and his ammunition, and we'd have ammunition again. And we were driving around there and shooting until Falcon told us that they had found Charles Miller. He was found in a trench. He had been killed, and that he called off our pursuit of the enemy at that stage. All right, as I said, most of the people were then fleeing. There were people in the river.
The stopper groups and the mounted group could not stop all the fleeing columns, but made sure that FAPLA had left most of their vehicles and many dead behind before the rest fled north. The fighting was over, and consolidation could now begin. When FAPLA fled, the men swept the base. They were very thirsty and hungry. Many swept through the town back to the base where the trenches were, with a mug in one hand and rifle in the other.
House clearing, we went back, and I remember I was thirsty as hell. I can't remember the exact time, never actually looked at it, but I was extremely thirsty. So we swept the line, and then I take out my fire bucket, shoot a hole through the drum, 44-gallon water. That was all over the base. I drink water, and then I saw the troops digging in with spoons where FAPLA was making food or brunch. And then I smell barbecue, fire, braai vleis. And then I took the wind direction, And I said, section of Alpha 1, let's go and see where's the braai vleis. Who in hell is making a braai vleis this time of the morning? So we came upon a 3-2 guy, completely burnt out. And the guy was lying on his stomach. And I asked the troop, now, who's this? You can't see whether it's a black guy or a white guy. And I tried to turn the guy over with my foot. Don't want to touch him. And as he rolled over, I saw the A-72. And I remember the only guy with the A-72 was our intelligence officer, temporarily allocated to Charles Miller. That's Tim Patrick. And so we found Tim Patrick. At that stage, we didn't know that Charles Miller is lost in action, missing in action. So, and I remember while sweeping the base, myself and then Ati Rooster from Alpha 2 with troops and a few troops of Foxtrot, we were standing there and said, okay, what's happening? We sweep the base, and all of a sudden, you know, this huge attack came from the north. And then it was from the north. And then we took decking and yeah, exactly as you said. So
all of a sudden, 122mm Mono Katyusha rockets began exploding all around them. Fortunately, nobody was injured during the bombardment, which, it turned out, was not an enemy counterattack at all.
Took over the town, and then we went across to rejoin them. And then they discovered a hell of a big cache of monokashitas, these rockets, big rockets.
Yeah.
One of them, how many meters did it say?
About 3 meters, I guess.
Next to the airstrip, there was a hell of a cache.
Didn't Gav Montron blow those things up?
Yeah. No, we didn't give Mon. That stuff up. I have to take the blame for that because what's his name? Ron. We had a sergeant there from England. Ron Gregory, very good guy.
The master moron.
And
but a wonderful guy.
No, he was a wonderful guy. He was very brave. He's actually an excellent guy. He was older than most of us, than all of us actually.
As by our generation.
He was in his 40s.
But he was in his 40s and still very fit and a very good NCO, and he was very respected by all of us, both troops and NCOs and officers. And Ron had always said to me, we are wasting explosives. If we want to blow something up, we must burn it. Burn it, burn it. We can save ammo, we can save explosives. And this stuck in my head, and that day when I saw these monokashitas, I thought to myself, well, why not put them all in one trench and make a big pile of it, and then put
remember the things exploding over the convoy as we were going?
Put wood on it and light the wood, and then the heat will sort of get all these rockets to explode. And so we did that, and I don't remember who, but somebody said to me, hey, I don't know what I was, if they said lieutenant or what. He said, Lieutenant, watch it. I was clever. I mean, what does he know? I had done dem school, so I didn't listen to anybody. So off we went.
Highly unusual for you, but
that's right, yeah. So we packed the rockets and put the wood on top and burnt it. And then we told everybody to clear out, yeah. Cleared the area and went back to the middle of the town and waited for this big bang where all the rockets will now explode. So waiting, I still remember we were sitting in the buffalo there, and I warned everybody not to go close, waiting for this explosion. The next moment, we just hear whoosh! The first rocket goes off. Nobody knew where it landed. So say over there, okay, the distance. So we looked at each other. The next moment, whoosh, in another direction. Now, they started the worst half hour in my life, because I thought to myself, if anybody gets killed today, it's my fault, because I had made
But you were off those vehicles quickly, remember?
No, we're sort of sitting and ducking on the buffle, because we didn't know where the next rocket was going to explode. I don't know how many rockets went off, but it must have been
There's quite a few.
many.
Yeah, plenty.
And they landed literally everywhere. South, north, west, east, in the middle of the town.
We've got a
between
few
the
more
two.
kills we never know about.
And it was a miracle that nobody got killed, because these rockets just were totally unpredictable. And it lasted, I think, for about half an hour. And then it sort of died down, and we knew most of the rockets.
But by then we did get.
The mortar platoon was called into Savate and redeployed to give support in case of a counterattack and to help mop up the base. There were no reports of enemy movement in the direction of Savate, neither from Kayundo nor Kwanger. The UNITA guerrillas to the west of Savate, who had been instructed to move towards the town, to take control of large stores of military clothing and tinned food, and also to take over the administration of the civilians who had fled the town, had not arrived by last light. There were only the 2 or 3 UNITA, who had traveled with Chief Staff Intelligence's Staff Sergeant Francisco. From the beginning, that was it. Leaving the Recce group in position as an early warning, in case FAPLA reinforcements were sent from Kayundo, Commandant Ferreira called the rest of his force away from the battle area, and loggered for the night near where his headquarters had come under mortar bombardment. The wounded Corporal Andy Falcas make it to the medical post. Unfortunately, he died of his wounds later in the helicopter on the way back to Omauni. Most of the captured equipment and vehicles were removed from the town to the overnight logger. The night after the battle was spent in a cold, dark bivouac. No lights or fires were permitted. Despite a comprehensive victory over the defenders of Savate, there was a feeling of despondency, even gloom, among the soldiers. There is no doubt that the effect of the large number of casualties was sorely felt. The troops were grieving. It was also apparent that the losses sustained were keenly felt at higher headquarters. During the night, Commandant Ferreira received a personal message from General Viljoen, the chief of the South African Army, instructing him to return to Rundu in order to make a full report on the operation. He was also instructed to send the battalion back to the battlefield, to find and recover the bodies of the missing people. Commandant Ferreira requested that he be allowed to return to Savate to personally command the battalion in its search for the bodies. He proposed that Commandant Ilshig return to Rundu in his stead to report on the operation. Shortly after this, Commandant Ilshig received an instruction by radio from his own higher headquarters, instructing him to do exactly that.
My backpack, as we called it in the Sheilahs, had gone skywards at some point during the day because this attack was in late May, the 21st of May 1980, and the grass was dry already. Rain had come and gone a long time ago, it was dry grass. So I had nothing. I had no food, I had no sleeping bag, nothing. Radio, gone. So that evening we camped under a massive tree. And I know Peter tried to look for this tree when they went back in 2010. So we're under the tree now, various people are passing me bits and pieces of rack packs. There's summer sleeping bags which were made out of parachute material, and I was stuffing these parachute material bags into one another. There's several people have said here, Sam and others, that was a cold evening, you know. It wasn't summertime, it was cold. So I was doing the best with what the guys could give me, and I was down on one knee, stuffing this bag. I hadn't had time to reflect on the day yet, when I felt a tap on my shoulder. And I looked up and it was Peter. And Peter leaned into me and he said, "Fitzy, tonight you pray to God. And you're going to have to forgive me if I get a bit emotional. He said, tonight you pray to God. And you thank God for saving us today." And I looked up at Peter and said, "Okay, Pete." And he said, "I'm serious with you. You thank God tonight for saving our lives."
There was still no sign of Corporal Edward Engelbrecht, or the other missing troop. On 22nd of May at 0745, the Puma also brought in Major Viljoen. While the dead were being put into body bags, the force continued mopping up Savate and searching for the 2 missing soldiers. The Recces also received instructions to return to Savate from their ambush positions. It was much easier for them to drive the enemy vehicles they had captured than to walk all the way. Commandant Ferreira then instructed Lieutenant Robbie to take his recce team on a reconnaissance towards Kayundo, to make sure no enemy was advancing towards Savate. Lieutenant Robbie's team, accompanied by Major Viyun, and another team drove in 2 buffles following the road past the recce group ambush position. About 5 kilometers further we saw vehicles in the distance. First, they could not make out if the vehicles were static or moving. They approached the vehicles, driving slowly. Then they debussed from the buffles and approached the enemy vehicles in attack formation. As they came closer, they realized the vehicle was static. They did not see anybody but heard people moaning. There were, at least 12 vehicles of different makes parked randomly near the road. They carefully opened the back tarpaulin of a Ural truck, and discovered that it was packed with 122mm projectiles. Other members opened other vehicles and found many dead enemies. There were many seriously wounded enemies in other vehicles. FAPLA had abandoned their dead and wounded. There were at least 80 dead and wounded in the vehicles. They set the ammunition vehicles alight and returned to Savate. 2 enemy soldiers were found wandering around Savate and were captured. At 10:15 Major Viyun, the captured enemy, a wounded child, the dead and the last 5 lightly wounded were airlifted out by Puma and transported to Rundu. The post-battle cleanup in Savate was harder for some than others. The attack on Savate was the first time since 1976 that the old Bravo Group, now 3-2 Battalion, had gone into combat against FAPLA. When they fled to South Africa in 1975 and 1976, the former FNLA guerrillas left behind relatives with whom they lost contact. Many of these relatives continued their lives in Angola, and it is probable, although one will never know for sure, that some became conscripts in FAPLA or voluntarily joined the Angolan military. During and after the attack, some of the 3-2 Battalion men discovered their relatives serving with FAPLA in Savate. By afternoon on 22 May, the mopping up was complete, but the 2 missing persons had still not been found. Also, no UNITA force had yet arrived. Commandant Ferreira decided to withdraw to Omauni, but at 19:00, Major Viyun radioed to say that higher headquarters had ordered that they return to Savate, and stay in position for at least 72 hours, and that Corporal Engelbrecht had to be found at all costs. It was never confirmed whether this decision to stay longer was made to allow time for UNITA to occupy the town. Commandant Ferreira knew that FAPLA was by now aware that 3-2 Battalion had attacked, and not UNITA, and was obviously concerned about his men's safety, and a possible counterattack from Kayundo. The War Diary entry explains Ferreira's concerns. Meanwhile, at higher headquarters, there was concern over a possible FAPLA air retaliation on Commandant Ferreira's forces, and on the military base in Rundu. 4 Impala strike aircraft were sent from Ondongwa to Rundu as a show of force. Commandant Ilshig was airlifted by Puma to Omauni, and from there by light aircraft to Rundu. He and Major Viyun had some explaining to do. At 21:00 on 22 May, from the Rundu headquarters operations room, Major Viyun plotted Commandant Ferreira's overnight position as 10 kilometers southwest of Savate. The next morning, Commandant Ferreira informed his men about the instructions to stay in the area and sent some men back to look for the missing men. At 10:20, their bodies were found about 800 meters from the original medical evacuation point, where they had dug a trench in anticipation of the battle's end and their evacuation.
And they brought 1 Quay 100. Jim said to me, get on the front. I got a mag, tied the mag to the bonnet of the Quay, put up the sandbags. I was now the front gunner, and we drove back to the dispersal point. At the dispersal point, Jim said, all right, guys. So we formed up in, only the leader group. The troops didn't come along. Only the white leader group did this operation. The corporals and the lieutenants. That's our troops, and Ferreira had said, it's your men, you recover them. So we were sweeping through And I told them as we went, this is where we formed up, this is where we had the first contact. I remember almost here that somebody told me that the sergeant is down, and a few hundred meters in, somebody found the bodies. He was not killed on impact, he was only wounded. So when I said somebody must look at him, the platoon signaller is the guy that got hold of the corporal. And he dragged him out of the contact behind the big Mopani tree. And they were waiting there because we were soon going to come back. That's the drill, not a problem. But when the counter-attack came, they found themselves in the front line. And this signaller, whose name I did not remember because I never knew it, I had only had the platoon for 2 days, and which to my shame I had never written a medal citation for. He had dug a hole with his hands because I remember his fingernails being ripped off, some of them. He dug a hole, put a ground sheet over Engelbrecht, and then lay on top of him with the 2 AKs, and he defended as long as he could. He was obviously killed, and the enemy walked up to him, not knowing that there was a white body by him, because that was the fear of the time, that a white person, a South African, would be abducted or the body would be recovered and propaganda would be made of it. That was the great fear of the time. And they had actually stood there with a machine gun, a PKM or a RPD, and shot him to pieces, not knowing that Engelbrecht was under him. So he was still there under the ground sheet when we found him. Otherwise his body would have been removed.
As Commandant Ferreira had predicted, the enemy conducted an air reconnaissance. Chief Staff Intelligence reported that FAPLA had also sent 2 helicopters to the area and that UNITA had shot down one somewhere between Cayundo and Savate. The helicopter burned out and the crew and passengers were killed. Alpha Company was tasked with driving out some of the captured vehicles. In fact, because of the shortage of drivers, most of the white leader group who could were driving vehicles loaded with captured equipment. By midday on 23 of May, the UNITA occupation force had still not reached Savate. The 3-2 battalion men were not aware that UNITA had trained semi-regular battalions and took it for granted that the guerrillas they encountered along the route would occupy Savate. At 20:00 on 23 of May, Lieutenant Rate and the Recce group driving captured vehicles arrived at the Omauni base, and by 05:00 on 24 of May the total force was back at base. At 11:00 the next day, the first vehicles transporting the force back to the Buffalo base left Omauni. After some delays and breakdowns, the last of the companies arrived back at Buffalo on 26 of May. During the day, a UNITA semi-regular battalion arrived at Savate to dominate the area. On the morning of 24 of May 1980, a newspaper headline in South Africa declared, 81 terrorists killed in Southwest Africa. According to the report, security forces walked into an enemy ambush on the border and 5 soldiers were killed. It named 5 of the 6 white men who died at Savate, but made no mention of the black Portuguese speakers who fell. Neither was there any mention of the many acts of bravery displayed by the men of 32 Battalion, on that day, actions that to this day have never been recounted in public, actions that under normal circumstances would have earned the highest decorations for bravery. As this was a UNITA operation, there would be no pomp and ceremony, no medal parades. Only the Air Force recommended their pilots for bravery awards, and Captain Johann Mertz, therefore received a well-deserved honoris crux decoration. In all, 15 men of 3-2 Battalion were killed, 5 were very seriously wounded, 8 seriously wounded and 13 lightly wounded, up to then the highest casualty count in any attack. The men who were killed were Captain Andre Erasmus, Lieutenant Charles de J. Muller, 2nd Lieutenant Timothy Simmons Patrick, 2nd Lieutenant Johannes Matthias Heinz Muller, Corporal Edward Coetzee Engelbrecht, Lance Corporal João Comba, Lance Corporal Andrew Jeremy Falcus, Rifleman Rodriguez Alberto, Rifleman Benedito Albino, Rifleman Antonio Caliongo, Rifleman Manuel Augusto, Rifleman Castro Marcelino, Rifleman Joaquim Matamba, Rifleman Sebastião Angelo, Rifleman Abel Living. Wounded, 2nd Lieutenant J. Roberts, 2nd Lieutenant J. Taylor, Corporal C. Nell, Lance Corporal D. Klein, Rifleman G. Agostinho, Rifleman A. Antonio, Rifleman P. Antonio, Rifleman J. Augusto, Rifleman M. Baca, Rifleman M. Borges, Rifleman A. Casual, Rifleman T. de Cunha, Rifleman Z. Eduardo, Rifleman P. Elias, Rifleman J. Francisco, Rifleman R. Gabriel, Rifleman N. Gomez, Rifleman R. Irmao, Rifleman G. Karambu, Rifleman M. Kioa, Rifleman J. Martins, Rifleman J. Quishuia, Rifleman J. Raphael, Rifleman F. Shipo, Rifleman P. Vika, Rifleman M. Vudi. Radio intercepts presented by CSI revealed 558 FAPLA killed, wounded or missing. 38 years after the battle, a FAPLA sergeant who fought in the battle spoke out. An Angolan journalist, Fernando Caetano, on 14 May 2018 reported under the heading Battle of Savate occurred in 1980 with heavy casualties. An extract and direct translation from Portuguese from the article. One of the Savate survivors is now the region's governor, Kangwum Chingano, at the time a former FAPLA sergeant. Chingano recalled with sadness the moments he spent during the clashes and stated that, according to his estimate, over 500 people must have died. The following is the destroyed and captured list, as it appears in the Chief Army Memorandum 20 of 80, dated 29 May 1980. The large number of own force casualties, coupled with the adverse reaction to the incident in the international media, created something of a furor in South African military and political circles at the highest level, and Chief Army, Lieutenant General Viljoen was instructed by Chief SADF General Magnus Malin, to convene a detailed inquiry into the circumstances of the Savate battle. On 26 and 27 of May, Lieutenant General Constant Viljoen attended the debriefing at Rundu. It was discovered that the attack had never been authorized, because of the misspelled Afrikaans abbreviation. Only a reconnaissance was authorized. The fact that South African troops were used to support this attack against an Angolan government target made it imperative to get State Security Council authority. Army Headquarters or Chief Staff Intelligence did not know about this attack. General Officer Commanding Southwest Africa Command did not ask authority for the attack. General Officer Commanding Southwest Africa Command only authorized the recce. He however said that, if the recce was reported to be positive, he, in any case, would have given instructions to proceed with the attack. The only action taken was a complete review of the operational command and control doctrine governing South African Defence Force participation in UNITA operations, based on the principles of avoiding, where possible, the use of South African Defence Force or Southwest Africa Territorial Force troops against purely FAPLA targets and obtaining State Security Council authority when to do so proved unavoidable. Despite the heavy casualties, the capture of Savate altered the military situation in the southern part of the Kwango-Kubango province. With the threat against Kwanga removed, the major military objective of the South African Defence Force and UNITA strategy for the province had, in fact, been achieved by securing the Okavango River on the border with Southwest Africa and thereby preventing the opening up of a possible SWAPO infiltration route. Even though Mpupa remained in FAPLA's hands, it was not seen as a threat because of its isolation. By early August, it had become apparent from SADF and UNITA intelligence sources that FAPLA intended to recapture Savate. With a view to warding off the attack, UNITA reinforced the battalion already in Savate with one of the semi-regular battalions. On 16 August, a FAPLA helicopter-borne force surprised the defenders at Savate and succeeded in taking the town. The FAPLA follow-up occupation force, traveling by vehicle from Kayundo, however, was ambushed 3 days later before reaching Savate. The occupation force fled, leaving behind 30 dead and 38 brand-new vehicles. The UNITA victory forced FAPLA to abandon the area completely and they retreated to Kayundo. After this, 2 additional UNITA semi-regular battalions were deployed in the Savate area, to conduct follow-up operations against the demoralized FAPLA forces. Encouraged by the ease with which Rivungo had been captured in July, and the manner in which UNITA had beaten off a FAPLA attempt to recapture Savate in August, UNITA demonstrated its newfound conventional capability, by attacking and defeating the FAPLA battalions at Luangwe and Mavinga. Their success, however, was short-lived. In October, FAPLA launched Operation Red May. With massive air support, between 1 and 2 of November, they retook Savate. They did not, however, move beyond Savate, leaving the towns along the Okavango River in UNITA's hands. In January 1981, UNITA recaptured Savate. By then they had also captured Pupa, and, until the border war ended in 1989, retained control of the area and prevented any SWAPO infiltrations. A Savate veteran, who was part of the 2012 Savate monument unveiling, who at the time was not aware that FAPLA had recaptured Savate after 21 of May said, "They took us to the airstrip, pointing out trenches and gun placements. There were lots of them." I then understood why Sam Heap decided to pull the 2 Charlie platoons back. It was plain suicide, and obviously had been the correct decision at the time. What amazed me was the number of trenches north of the runway. We had missed the bulk of the base in 1980. The FAPLA guide showed the men the November 1980 FAPLA base, therefore the veterans comment. The same happened during a 2023 battlefield tour. When the battlefield tour started, the guides on foot led the group to the north of the runway, where they said the base was. The group was unaware that they were taking them to the same base, which was showed to the 2012 tour group, and made out to be the target Charlie Company attacked on 21 of May 1980. After a long walk, a Savate battle veteran realized what was happening, and stopped the proceedings, and the men were guided to the 21 of May 1980 Savate base. The only signs of battle left of the base are a few hollows in the ground at some places, which once were trenches. Overgrown vegetation, or new buildings near the road, covered the entire area. In some places, old and rusted food tins were visible. The trees did not show any bullet marks. Scrap metal dealers have taken away the 2 shot-out GSP amphibious pontoons, and all other vehicle wrecks. The Savate battlefield now is just another piece of land in Angola, and is unrecognized as a battlefield should one not know there once was a fierce battle fought on that ground.